In this video, I'm going to set up pixel art so that I'll show you how to color a black and white image. So starting from the top, I'll set up the environment for Django. So I'll seed into pixel art, set up the virtual environment, and the next step will be to start Django. Just give this a second to run. Then I'll also open a new tab and set up WebSockets, also using the same virtual environment. Now, good news that comes with this is there was a previous bug that I mentioned that happened with the page. If you opened it and tried to click any part of the image, the bottom section that was supposed to appear that would allow you to edit the image was not showing up. I found out there was actually based on a bug that I introduced by deleting some files, trying to keep the project as minimal as I could, but some of these files were my reference in the backend, causing the issue. While I was also working on this, I was able to increase the time that it takes to render the image, decrease this so that right now it basically takes very few seconds to do this, which is a huge improvement in terms of speed. So the first thing that I'll do is select the image that you're going to be working with. This one, give it a second to upload. I'll also make sure that I've disabled my connection to my Bluetooth device so that there is not any audio leaking in from another source. Okay. So the first step is to select where I'm going to work with, zooming into the lips so that I can start by coloring this section first. Okay, there seems to be an issue with this, so I'm just going to refresh the page and I'll zoom in again into the lips and use this section first. So with this area selected, the next step is I'm going to select some colors from the lip, using add color. So I'm just going to shade in some of the area. Try to keep within the lip edges, because one thing that I've noted is if you actually try and shade in and you go above or beyond the lip section, the result is less appealing or realistic. So it will be better if you can actually shade within the lips, which gives results that's more realistic. So I'm going to try and do this using the eraser where I can, trying to keep within this section. Okay, selection now finished. I can move on to now shading. And shading, I'm just also going to keep within the lips. Keeping to as much as I can within the lip area. And where actually I do go beyond, just use the eraser to keep within. So if you are looking at this, you'll notice at some point I do select eraser. So one thing with the way that I'm recording this video, I've come to realize is it doesn't show the mouse button, the mouse icon, so it may be a bit difficult on your end to tell what I'm clicking, but just looking at the buttons you can tell hopefully what I've clicked and what I've not clicked. I'll try and record the next video with this in mind. So next step is to search for pink lipstick, which is the shade of color that I'm going to be using. With a shade picked, I can use this X code. Also use switch color and key perspective, then render the image. Okay, this first result doesn't look as close as it can actually get to pink. So I'm just going to check for another shade. Of pink. The tool that I'm using is called Colorzilla, just in case you're curious. This is available on Firefox and Chrome. As you can see, it's that eyedropper tool at the top navigation. So using this shade tool, I've now come up with the result. I'm going to try and darken it up a bit. See how it looks. Because actually this takes relatively a short amount of time to run, I can experiment with changing the color until I find something that is as close to what I actually want. So using this again, I can now try again. And I think I'm going to keep this now. So the next step is to now, using zoom, selecting the area where I'm going to be working on next, which is a skin, starting with a face. So in this step, I'm going to use add color and shade in as much area as I can. So with this, I'm going to try and shade in within the area, trying to keep as much as I can from going outside of the borders. And the key thing is, from doing this multiple times, I've come to realize with her eyelids, it's hard to actually make them darker. They actually are darker compared to a skin color, so it will look realistic, but it will look more like a darker shade of skin than actually how actual eyelid looks, which is black as your hair. But actually just trying to select eyelids different from my eyes from the rest of the skin is actually a more complicated process. So just selecting it with the skin still gives you a realistic result. And for now, this is good enough for this part of the project, since the main point is to show you how the web app works and how to use it. While in future I can look into how I can best add some improvements to this, making it easy to use and easy to manage. So one recommendation that I was given by a friend is, if you can't keep track of the selection that you've done at any point, so for example, like this area that I'm now shading in, if I can keep track of where I've shaded and save this and link this and be able to view the shaded area and select it later on, you don't have to keep on shading every single time. You can just shade in one time and then use it multiple times if you're working on the same image, and this can actually save you time. Same case scenario for also selecting the colors that you're actually trying to use. But for this, I'm actually considering since it is doable how to be able to figure out which shading files you used before, one idea may actually be naming the files, or actually being able to view a small icon that shows you the shaded area relative to the size of the image that you're working on, which hopefully may be able to tell you what you're working with, but the best option is still naming the file. So using this, you might actually be able to save some time when you're working on an image multiple times. And with this in mind, I may actually work on this as a new feature later on for the project. Now, one thing is how I usually do this is to try and keep as close as I can to the edges, but using the mouse I tend to always go beyond, so I just keep track of where I've done this. Then I use the eraser to erase these sections, then shade again, and just rinse and repeat till I get as close as I can to the edges of what I'm selecting. Now, there are tools that actually can show you what you are selecting, one of them being OpenCV, which can get the borders of an image, which in this case may be an outline of a face, the text that is in this image, and so on. So if it can actually give you the borders of this, and you can use these border areas as the selection areas of where you want. So instead of actually shading, similar to actually how you use something like Photoshop, where you just use an outline of the area that you're interested in, and based on the outline, everything that lies within the outline is considered what you are interested in. Something similar to this may make this selection process much simpler, though this is also a monumental task considering doing this with JavaScript, because I'd have to consider one additional task that will be really useful with the outline, is having multiple draggable points which can show you the outline of what you're selecting. So hopefully, if you, the listener, have actually used Photoshop before to outline areas, you'll know what I'm talking about. But I'll also try and at the end of this maybe look for an example of doing this from Google, a separate video where I can show you all these core concepts that can be added to this. So if you're actually wondering how I'm able to concentrate on shading while also talking fluently in this video, first time that I recorded this video, the audio didn't come out as well as expected, so I'm recording the audio the second time. So in this video, I'll just keep to the key notes of what needs to happen, and in the upcoming video that I'll be doing a colored example, starting with an image which has 4 cars tucked in, and then coloring each of the 4 cars. I'll cover everything that I believe will be necessary for this. So at this point, I actually realized that I was using add color, which wasn't what I was expecting I was doing. I was expecting I was using shade area, which would have been really useful if I had that additional feature of using the shade tool. I could have just done this, saved the data, loaded it on shade area, and then done the same for add color, which would have saved me some time. But in this case, because I'm actually using add colors, it would be detrimental to actually select the leaves, which would give the pink color, which is not actually something I'm trying to work with. So I only want to work with the gray colors on our skin. And so now the next step is to now shade in again as much of her face as I can, trying to keep within the borders, trying to do this neatly as possible. And when this is done, select shade area, then the next step will be to render. Now, as I will point out, because I've already run this video before, this process actually runs relatively quickly, more or less maybe 3 to 5 seconds, which in reality I think is more on the sides of about 2 to 3 seconds, actually, considering if I do remember how long it took. So this video actually, in comparison, I do spend a more amount of time doing the shading and the selecting and actually rendering this. So if you do consider the implications of this, it means even using a CPU on my PC, which relatively to other PCs benchmarks, I'd compare it to a low-end i5, Core i5. So only using a CPU, it still runs really fast. So even without making the code to use GPU, this is actually fast enough for production. And using a much faster machine, which would be, in today's specs, we're talking about an i7, you're looking at speeds which are about 4 times faster to this. So with speeds relative to that, you may actually not necessarily need to tailor make the code to work with a GPU, but just scaling your CPU to be able to run concurrently multiple tasks, and load balancing if you find that if you're running this on a server and handling multiple requests, because running this on a one user system, it's not going to be an issue, whereas actually running it on a server where you're expecting multiple people to be using it may make your system a bit slower. So that's why you may actually consider whether or not you want to use a GPU, or if you actually want to scale your CPU to handle the tasks multiple at a time, or even load balancing where you have a main server which handles the main request, and depending on the load balancing, it has redundant servers below it which basically have the same code, which you can pass the request, it does the processing, and then returns the result. So based on how you'll find this process takes in terms of speed, if you do this correctly, you are looking at a process that should take for you seconds or even milliseconds if you've optimized your system well enough. So for me at this particular point, I was trying to select the eye as closely as I can, which meant a lot of back and forth using the eraser and the shading tool. Based on now just looking at so far what's remaining, I'll still be doing more of that till I'm relatively satisfied with the selection. But I can tell you beforehand, the final result will actually look pretty impressive. So I'm just going to leave this running for a while. By this I mean just going to observe what actually may be the next step. which I don't believe is for now anything more relevant to add on to this. So while this continues running, just going to check if there's any additional points that I can add on what may be the core features of this. One thing to take into heart is the main additional features that I may be considering more pertinent to add to this is making it simple for you to do this. Also, I was interested in seeing if machine learning script can do this, and relatively to how quickly these colors, it's much faster than a machine learning scripts that actually do auto coloring of images, which do tend to take a while to color an image. So using an object segmentation model that would give instruction to the image to color editor. So basically, ignore the step where you are doing this manually. Have a sort of an API that can allow a machine learning script to send direct information to this script, which will process the image, return a result, and you'll get a colored image much faster, since my estimation is that object segmentation models these days tend to take real-time processing with models which are usually called YOLO, which is you only look once. And using such models, I can get a snapshot, just sending it an image, since this is not a video and you only look once, is models that have been tailor-made to actually be able to do object segmentation in real time on videos. So on only an image, this should be a relatively, in comparison, a fast process. Using this, it will be able to send object segmentation or ideas on how to color the image. So the model, how I imagine this would go, would have multiple examples of colored and uncolored images, black and white. So it's pretty simple to get multiple images which are colored and those which are not colored, and then the model will now segment the image based on similar colors. So for example, her face on a real image would have a similar color hue. Basically, you're talking about skin color. Same case for maybe the background, which may be a background color because it has a similar kind of hue to it. Even on a grayscale image, you can sort of tell that this is something that is similar to that because of the outline of a face and how much the background basically of a face looks in black and white. So using this, the model will just be recommending some colors on how the model should be, how the image should be colored. This would be fed to this. It would return a colored image. This would have an error, basically how close it is to the real image, and then back and forth of error correcting, where the model would now send new requests trying to be as close to the actual image as it can, may actually get real results. So using this, I should be able to get what I hope to be an actual result. The cool thing is with this, I won't necessarily have to name an object, to just have to more intuitively guess what it's looking for. So now the next step here is to try and look for a shade of her skin color using the color picker. I've selected one of the colors, so I'm just going to paste in the hex code of this color. Make sure to use switch color and keeps perspective, and in a few seconds we get our final result, which looks pretty impressive, if I do say so myself. So the next step will be to update the image, which now pushes the image from the right to the left, so it becomes the image that I'm now going to be working with. Okay, so while we move on to the next step of shading another section of her body, which will be her left shoulder, and finally I'd move on to the right shoulder. So the next step is similar to what I did before, is just zooming into this section, picking the colors of what I'm going to be working with, which is just because I've already picked the color, I just need to get the area where it needs to work on, so that it will ignore anything else that is not within this area, making sure not to go beyond this area. Now the cool thing is, working with colored images, you tend not to get color hues which are similar like a black and white image. So with a colored image, you can't necessarily find that you can move on and get good results with using select area to select your area, provided that you've actually selected all the colors that you want to work with. So the next step is to just use the eraser to make sure that I haven't gone overboard in any of the sections. So using this, just going to make sure that I keep within the edges of the image, just brushing it in, making sure that I keep as close as I can to the edges. So while I'm working on waiting for this process to be finished, selecting the shading, I'm going to move on to the final step, which will just be to render and show you the final result. So I believe I'm almost done with this. Now relatively, because this video in terms of length, most of this actual work is how to use this. You can see here that this is the final result of rendering her left shoulder, which has the same tone as the rest of her body, So this is why it will be important to try and keep to the same hex code that you've used and the color code that you used, and also the point where you clicked, which gives it a gradient ratio of how to do relative to the other places. So if you clicked another part of a skin which is darker to this, you might end up with a rendering of her skin which is darker than the rest of what you did. So for this particular reason, it will be important to make sure that you use the same color code all over to places where you're actually trying to use, depending on how realistic and close match that you need your area to be. So if there's a huge variation, the more that you need to consider how accurate you do this. But on the plus side, if you consider how long it takes to actually process this, you can actually safely tinker, learn how to use it, and spend less time actually waiting for the process to finish. So the next step is to now move on to the glitter, which is her dress. So this is a dress that seems to have some glittering effects. So the first step is to select some of the color of the dress. Then I'm going to search for some glittering dress so that I can use some of the color code in this example. Okay, using this, you can just paste in this code and then use this on the image, making sure to use switch color and keep perspective, so it switches the color and gives a realistic look. So the next step is to now zoom into the section of where the dress is, so that I'll have an easier time shading. With this in mind, I've already now zoomed into this area. So now I'm using the shade area to shade within this area. Like usual, first starting with the edges, just to get a rough feel of where the edges are. When I'm done with this, I'll shade in the inner part. Because for this part actually there is nothing to consider, because I actually want the effect to apply to all of the or everywhere that's inside this. And once this is done, there's going to be some back and forth on the edges, trying to get it right and not exceeding the edges. You may likely find that you do exceed the edges, so it's always a question of the work that you've done. Is it realistic enough to take home? Is it good enough to move on to the next step? So what I'd prefer here, this example, is to try and show that you can actually get pretty good results with this, and with better selection you'll only get better results, to the point where you can actually relatively say to any other image editing tool it can be on par in terms of this particular skill of coloring an image. As I was saying before, automation is a really cool feature For example, Photoshop has a system that can auto-select cells based on how the colors are similar to each other, which tends to be used a lot for background removal, as an example. So using this, it tells me that it is possible to find tools that can allow me to search for cells which are similar. Even though this project is not the only thing that I'm working on, I am confident that in my free time I can always find time to improve on it and expand on it. One thing to note is Color Editor is not the only application that is available in pixel art. There is also Color Picker, which is not that impressive. It just does the same thing as ColorZilla, which picks a color code, which is from an image that you've uploaded, which is relatively useful if you don't have ColorZilla installed and you need to select colors. I just basically still keep it available because the code is there and it works nicely. Also, there is Delete Color, which is going to allow you to delete sections of an image, and it's one way of making a PNG where, for example, if you wanted to delete a background of where you are at, just leaving you, that's what I hoped that particular part would be able to do, though that project is still in development. It doesn't use WebSockets, which I intend to have it use, and some additional skills improvements such as this, making it faster, simpler to use, and relatively adding all the additional features that I found are useful after using Color Editor will also be moved to Color. I'll delete Color. And finally, there's I intended to make merge images, which would allow you to set up a background either using a color that you've picked. It could be white, gray, or any color that you want, then possibly using the delete color icons that you've created, using using these delete colors that you've created, you can now impose on them and end up telling this is what you're going to add to merge images. Okay, as you can tell now, the dress actually is finished and it looks really nice. So I'm going to move on to the next step, which is working on the background. So the next step is to now work on the background by first selecting an area I'm going to zoom into, which will be the top right corner. So first is just also selecting the colors of what I'm going to be working with, and the color I'm going to replace it with, which is just going to be a shade of pink. Using this shade of pink and the area that I've selected, after using switch color and keeps perspective, I just need to shade the area that I'm interested in, which is just going to be starting with this area section, which is in my left section. So this is going to be simpler because all I'll need to do we shade the gray area and avoid. So with this in mind, I'm just going to try and shade in all of the gray area. Keeping to the edges, and where necessary using the erase tool to erase. So because in this section most of the areas actually have already been colored, such as her skin and the dress, the borders actually touching these isn't quite an issue, and the white border around the gray area doesn't have much, so that also shouldn't be affected. The black text and the white text also is not going to be affected because they also don't match the colors of what color editor is looking for. As you'll see here as a final result, I actually did what was expected, with a little bit of a hitch where I selected too close to the corner. So with this, I actually didn't get some of the border. So the next step is to now use shade area and select it so I can remove the previous selection, make a new selection, and try again. Because I've already done this before, the first time that I did this, shade area actually didn't, the data actually wasn't saved for the shaded area, so it actually did this for the whole image. So I had to select the area again, but again, because of the speed that this actually takes, I don't consider this to be a huge issue, and it was actually more on my part clicking render before shade area had already finished getting the area of what it was looking for. As you can see now, actually now that is shade area getting the area, so that was actually done before, after that this was done. So because of that, you can see that it actually went beyond, affected some of the other parts on the right of the image, even some part of her hair. And because of this, the best option is to use shade area again, so I can limit it to specifically where I wanted, so that I can actually get a pretty good result, which is what I'm hoping for. The cool thing though is because I've already done this, I can tell you beforehand the result actually will look really good. As you can tell, it's going to be as similar to the way it's on the left section of the image, as you can see. As for the few small dots of area, I don't consider this to be a huge of an issue, because as I said, this is more about fine-grained accuracy, which is something which points more to the tool, the data that's being sent to the backend, than the system having any bugs in it. So finally, I'll need to select some of this color, which you can tell is actually pretty small, because there isn't that much gray color to go around anyway. And then the next step is to just shade into this without too much concern about the borders, because the border is white and it's going to ignore white because it doesn't match up with the color that's being specified. So with this, I just also shade in between. Make sure that I shade all the area in between here. It shouldn't take too long. Once this is done, just render this part. Then this tutorial will be complete, and we can move on to the final example of working with a colored image. Fortunately though, as you will find that working with a colored image has less of a work involved compared to this. Now you can finally tell this is the final example, and this concludes my tutorial on how to use color editor with a colored image. In the next section, we'll cover what remains, and there'll be a final video on future updates.